Kia ora koutou katoa, talofa lava, whakalofalahi atu, maloni, polovinaka, and kia ora, everybody. Thank you so much, Marilyn, for your wonderful words and for such a fantastic introduction. It makes us very humble and makes us feels more than what we feel like every day. So thank you so much for all those acknowledgements. Te Le Vā, I am going to just share the screen with us here and get this going. I think Scott's recording at the moment. So, talofa lava, everybody. Thank you again for that introduction. Olivia Taouma. What we're going to do is puluhi ki tua, kikitia mitaki amua, looking to the past to clearly see the way forward. And so that's how we're just going to run today's talk. We're going to go into the past and talk about kind of the Pacific setting in the world and the history and the relationships of Aotearoa, and then move into Auckland and then specifically into the museum and what Te Le Vā is, and also how we actually enable it and enact it in the museum. As we know, New Zealand is a South Pacific nation with strong cultural, economic and political relationships with other Pacific states and territories. We have a long history together. This history goes as way back as the whakapapa with tangata whenua, from the boats from the Pacific into Aotearoa, and our migration from various parts of the Pacific throughout the last 150 years. Sometimes people do forget that we are a South Pacific nation ourselves as we sit in the Pacific Ocean. So what I have here is some prompting questions and discussions that I'm just going to use to help the talk this evening. One of them I always get asked in my role with other people who aren't from Aotearoa, who often come in and are working with us, is why do Pacific people come here? So Pacific people have had a long history. As I've said, for the last 150 years, we've come here through trade, through marriage, through education opportunities. One of the things with marriage that I want to touch upon as a great example is we have in our gallery, and I'm just going to shoot down to this beautiful photo of the Cronfield family. And through marriage, we have Luisa, who's Samoan. She's actually, her father was Portuguese and her mother was Samoan. And Gustav Cronfield, who was a German trader. And both of them got married and then they settled in Auckland in 1890s. And that's quite a long time ago. And they came here and started up very successful businesses in Pacific import and exports. They're also very important because they had a big house in Eden Crescent, dubbed Oleula, that also housed and looked after many of the Pacific people that came to Auckland and came to Aotearoa. And this is one of the beautiful stories that we tell in our museum in the Tāmaki Heringawaka Gallery. And in this photo is quite significant because they also would take in a lot of our education scholarship students. So education was one of the other things I said of how Pacific people came here. For example, in Samoa's history from 1918 onwards, Zealand and Samoa was colonized and part of the Great Britain imperial reach into the Pacific, but New Zealand was the governing administrator, and they created educational scholarships. And these students would come here quite young, 12 to 13, 14 years of age on a boat. And when they were here, they weren't able to go back to the islands during the holidays as it was too long and too costly. And the Cronfield family was one of the few families that would open their doors and take in a lot of the Pacific scholarship students. And if you look in the back of this photo, there's a beautiful young woman with black long hair down one side, and that woman was going, well, in the history, became the beautiful, incredible, iconic Queen of Tonga, Queen Salote Tupou, and she was one of those students who was studying at Diocesan, and came and stayed with the Cronfield family, and this was in 1910. This is them, the family, and all their other family and friends going on camp on holiday up in Waiwera. And I love this photo because, that's a real camp with a real tent, very old-fashioned, but great. And that also shows kind of the vā and the relationships, which I will go into again when we get further on in this presentation. Why also do Pacific people come here? The scholarships and the education opportunities. For example, my father came here in 1956, and he was 12. He was one of the scholarship students on education, and he came up here on the boat and went up north to Whangarei Boys, where they stayed, and then he didn't actually return to Samoa until he was 27 years of age. So, a lot of these students then came here, they studied, they got married, they had children, and settled in here. So a lot of them either didn't return or they returned to a country where they actually had not spent that much time in their life, which had an impact also. The other thing was, when we talk about coming to New Zealand in Aotearoa, we have the Samoan community. A lot of them came, as I said before, because of the World War. After 1918, New Zealand had governorship over Samoa, but also Tonga community mostly came in the 1960s and 1970s, and that was because of jobs and working opportunities and the labour force. And then a lot of other Polynesians came at that time. The other countries that had real relationships with New Zealand at that time were Cook Island, Niue, Tokelau, because they were territorial Great British power. They were part of the Great Britain imperial power and stretched into the Pacific. And I just want to share this map because some people don't really understand what's been happening in the Pacific and the history when we talk about colonization. And I love to use this map. It's from 1939, and it just gives you a real slither of an example of all the different countries that were colonizing the Pacific in 1939. So at this point of time, you had France, you had Great Britain, you had Japan, you had Netherlands, you had Portugal, you had United States. And then later on, what's not in here is also you had Chile, because the Rapa Nui, or the Easter Islands, are with Chile. And then other countries have come in and out of this space. And one of the examples I want to show around how colonization really affects our Pacific island is you take the little island Palau, which is a tiny small island. And in 1710, this island nation was, in Western terms, discovered by Spain in 1710, and then it was sold to Germany later on, and then it was annexed by Japan, and then it was taken over by United States after World War II, and now has got free association with United States since 1994. So if you look at that period of time from 1710 to 1994, it's a long period of time for one small island to have many, many different colonial powers that have come in and influenced the culture, the language, and been the dominant culture and power in that tiny little island. So they've gone from Spain, So they've gone from Spain to Germany to Japan to America, and now to have some independence. What does that really look like for them and their culture after being so long under colonization, under so many people? And I also want to talk about, some people say, the word colonization is used a lot. And what does the word actual colonization mean? So, it's control or governing influence of a nation over an independent country or territory or people. And when you look at this map and you see how much control and influence of other countries and cultures and language has been in the Pacific over a long period of time. So, Palau, that was 1710. You can understand some of the trauma and also some of the huge impacts that this has had in the relationships and also in the culture and language itself. A really great example of language is Rotuma. It's a very tiny, small island just off Fiji, and it's one of the hardest written languages in the world, again, because of colonial impact and also religious impacts that has occurred on the island. And so you've got a mix of English, German, Samoan, Tongan, Fijian, and French. Now, that's quite a lot of influences on a language, in a written language especially. And so you can see kind of when we talk about colonization and its impacts, you're talking hundreds of years, and you're talking a lot of the culture and language being impacted greatly from all these different powers. We also talk about colonization and the relationship. When I talk about trauma, the trauma in some of these countries, we're at the moment, we're going through a COVID world pandemic, but it's not been the first. The Spanish flu was around in the 1918s, and that was an example of New Zealand as a country, Aotearoa as a country, who was administrator, government power over Samoa at that time, allowing a boat that was had already been told it was filled with very sick crew who had the flu, the Spanish flu, and there was in the world at that time quarantine procedures for that, and that was bypassed to allow the boat to land, as the New Zealand Governor General at that time was waiting for some cargo that was on that boat, and that was more important to him. And then what happened was that crew came out, and we lost 23 to 25% of the population died from that incident. So there's lots of different examples of really traumatic events that have occurred between New Zealand and in the Pacific. And I highlight that because people don't really understand some of the trauma and the mistrust of our Pacific people to being in New Zealand and some of the places like the museum. So people also came here, as I said, for the work. So here's a great example of, on the right here, we have a beautiful picture of the 1970s when 60s and 70s when we had an industrial boom and we had amazing workforce shortage, and we needed more of the workforce. We needed more workforce, so we drew on our Pacific relationships, and the New Zealand brought in a lot of our Pacific labour to fill that workforce. Here's a very happy job, industrial labour workplace. You can see some of the industrial machines behind them, and they're all getting on really well, and they're having a celebrational some sort of celebrational Pacific event, and they've got the pig out, and the bosses are there, and they're having a great time. This then turned very sour very quickly when the economic recession and bust happened, and high unemployment started happening. And I know that all of us know from recent events that what occurred shortly after this was the dawn raids and the propaganda that happened from the government out into the country around overstayers. And the reason why I use the word propaganda and overstayers and the targeting of Samoan and Tongans in that particular time, they were the majority of the Pacific people here, was the fact that Pacific people only made up 1/3 of overstayers. The 2/3 of overstayers, the majority of overstayers of that time, were never targeted. And that was because, well, I can't say why, but I can just tell you who they were. The 2/3 of majority of the overstayers that were here were from Great Britain and United States, but they were never targeted as the Pacific people were. And so that's part of, the trauma again, but this is time the trauma is on Aotearoa soil. And through a trust, like this shows great trust, great relationship being broken. And that trauma has seeped into generations of families because a lot of these people are still alive. There were 5,000 to 12,000 Pacific people affected. They had dogs arriving into their house at, 3 or 4 in the morning. They had church. So this is the church. Church was the center of our Pacific culture in New Zealand. This is a picture of the first church in 1947. That was PIC, the Pacific Island Congregational Church, that opened in Newton. It was the first church here that was of Pacific for Samoan, Cook Island, Niue, and Tokelauans. And the church became kind of like the center point where Pacific people could gather, socialize, celebrate their cultures and languages. So it became very significant than ever before. And we had in the dawn raids, police charging into churches. They were charging into homes at all hours, and a lot of illegal activity were occurring. And some of you may have heard of the Polynesian Panthers. And the Polynesian Panthers came about as a young group who were realized that a lot of what was happening was really unjust, but a lot of also was happening because our Pacific people weren't educated in the way around human rights and law. And so that is how they started working with our communities to affect change through education in that space. This picture on the left of PIC is one of our stories, not this picture, but PIC is one of the stories we also share and tell in our Headinga Waka gallery at Auckland Museum as being the first Pacific Island church in Aotearoa. So why are Pacific people important to museums in New Zealand? Well, museums, as we all know, reflect history, and they also tell our stories and information and knowledge and research. And so when we are telling our story of our taonga and our place and our history, we have to tell all the stories and all the connections. And when the museum has one of the largest, or has the largest Pacific collection in the whole of the Southern Hemisphere, which is Tāmaki Paenga Hira Auckland War Memorial Museum, then it has an extra responsibility and commitment to that taonga, to the place and people it came from, and that connection and that responsibility to really commit and focus to the relationship with the Pacific and the stories and the history of the Pacific that go hand in hand with that taonga. So here's just some statistics from 2018 census. Samoa remains the largest Pacific people ethnic group in Aotearoa at 49%. In Auckland, Samoan is the second language spoken in Auckland, because that's how large the Samoan population is here in Auckland. 62.3% of Pacific people were born in New Zealand, so not migrants. We're now getting into generations and generations of Pacific families. We have 65.9% of the whole of the Pacific population of New Zealand Aotearoa living in Auckland. This is why Auckland is the biggest Polynesian city in the world and the second biggest Pacific city in the world. And that's also part of our job at Tāmaki Paenga Hira, Auckland Museum, is to reflect those unique cultural aspects of Auckland. And as a city that is the biggest Polynesian city, we also need to reflect that as well. We have 46.1% of Pacific people less than 20 years of age, and 54.9% are younger than 25. This means the majority of our Pacific people are young. Over 50% are under 25. And that's a huge thing for us, because we know that that big under 25-year-old group are going to increase the population of Pacific people, but they also have a huge influence on the future of our Pacific. And we're the only ethnic group in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with such a high number of under 25-year-olds. This brings us to the museum. So I've talked a little bit about the museum and the fact that we have the largest Pacific collection in the Southern Hemisphere. It is world significant, and it is a real commitment for us to really reflect the unique cultural aspect of Auckland, which is the biggest Polynesian city in the world. So in 2012, the museum, and I take my hat off to the museum for this, because this is big vision work, created a 20-year vision called Future Museum, where they actually made a commitment and stated that they're in that responsibility of being Auckland Museum and holding the biggest Pacific collection in the Southern Hemisphere, that they will make a commitment to the Pacific and Pacific people, and they will call it the Pacific Dimension. This Pacific Dimension sits in connection with the Māori dimension of the museum. A lot of people didn't know what that meant, so we came together. I wasn't with the museum at that time. Leone was. So we're very fortunate to have Leone with us. And there was a lot of staff that came together, not just Pacific staff, Māori staff, Pākehā staff, and other staff that came together. And they created this incredible document. It was called Teu Le Vā, Nurture the Relationship. And basically, they broke down, what does the Pacific Dimension mean? It means to create a Pacific focus and a space within which to consider how we can strengthen the programs, the activities, the culture and ways of working within the museum that align with the objectives of Future Museum and the vision of the future. So really it's making a commitment to that focus to work with and for our Pacific communities and our Pacific taonga. So what does Teu Le Vā mean? Teu, T-E-U, means to beautify, cherish, or look after, protect, or nurture. Teu Le Vā is a Samoan term, but the concept of vā is far-reaching into the Pacific, using different terms in different ways. And again, because Samoan is the second language spoken in Auckland, Samoan was the words and the phrases that was used to capture this concept. Teu Le Vā. Teu, nurture, vā. Now, vā is a very deep and far-reaching concept. People have written PhDs and masters around this concept, and I'm going to try and bring it down in a very succinct way. It is the space between relationship as well as a physical spatial dimension. It is also a conceptual space bond connection. So what does that mean in reality? Vā is not just human-to-human relationship. So, for example, I've known Marilyn for a very long time, and we have a relationship. But Marilyn also knows my father and my mother, and that is a relationship. And I also know Leone outside of the museum, and her family outside of the museum. So there's all these people to relationships. Then we get to taonga. Taonga also have relationship. So taonga could be, for example, here we have this beautiful fan, okay, or a ili. This was a gift that was given to me around one of the community days, where one of our community knowledge holders gifted that to me. And now I have a connection to this and a memory to this of that person and that day and that event. So that is a relationship. We also have a relationship to location and place. So the museum sits on a hill, sits on the domain, and that has a history, that has a connection, and that has a relationship that we are also, we acknowledge, and we also work very closely with Auckland Council with, and the iwi of Ngāti Whātua o Rākai with, and Waikato Tainui, and Ngāti Pawa. So Vā is relationships in all the senses of what that is, and it also reaches through time. So a great example of Vā is when we had the Rotuman community come in, and they, one of the documentary heritage, Paula Legal, had a letter, and in the letter, she found a Rotuman letter. She found it in a book, and there was no context of what this letter was in connection to the book, or why it was in the book, and why there was this letter that was written by someone that was in Rotuma and describing a lot of the culture to someone that was in New Zealand. So she thought, well, why don't we bring it down to one of our Rotuman community days, and we'll just see what the community thinks about this, or if there's a connection, or if anyone knows anything. And the community came in, and one of our community people said, "Oh, what is this? I know this name. That's the grandfather of this young woman who's in the room." She came over and then connected to this letter and told us the story of who her grandfather was, and how this is an incredible part of history for them, because they have been trying to work out his story and his connection with this particular person. And the letter became a connector and became this really significant part of them, to see his handwriting, to see how he spoke and how he was talking about the culture. She then brought in her family at a later date, and the whole family came in and started telling the story and really connecting with our taonga and collection. And so that was really enriching for us to see and to experience. And that is real Vā, real Te Le Vā, when it happens. And the connection, that person, when he wrote that letter, he would never have dreamt that his granddaughter in the future, many, many years in the future, will find this letter in a museum and then have a connection and read this letter. And so that is such a beautiful moment in time and a place that the museum can play a really significant part in connecting and having the Te Le Vā occur. Marilyn has also talked about Maua Le Vā, Albert Wendt's statement about our Vā with others defines us. It's talking about our reputation and the way people look and feel about us as the museum. That comes from the communities and other people outside of the museum. And we have to nurture that, and we have to look after that, be great kaitiaki to that. So the way I like visuals. So we have to understand that our taonga were made for a particular purpose in a cultural context by particular people. Some way or other, they have ended up in the museum. Some of these ways have been through illegal means, which we acknowledge and we take responsibility for. And some of them have been gifts and acquisitions, loans, in many different ways, but they have ended up with us in Aotearoa at Tāmaki Paenga Hira. Part of Teu Le Vā framework and our Pacific dimension in the museum is to reconnect with our Pacific people, where these taonga came from, and play a pivotal part in looking after that relationship and that connection. So that's a diagram that kind of shows how that has happened over time. What is Teu Le Vā? It is values and principles, Pacific values and principles. It is about meaningful engagement, going away and moving from transactional engagement that used to occur in institutes like the museum, where people came in, bought a ticket, saw whatever they saw, and they left. We're now much more invested in creating meaningful engagement with people and develop and sustain those relationships with our Pacific communities. We have integrity with those relationships, and we empower and enable space and platforms for our Pacific people to have their voice and their stories and their language and perspective heard, and authenticity. That authenticity has been really important to us. And one of the things that I've been working on since my time in the museum is our Pacific Language Weeks online. And especially through COVID, that has been really pivotal for us. And this has allowed a lot of our Pacific people an opportunity to have a voice, tell their stories and their perspectives in connection to the taonga that we have in the museum itself. And so there's links at the end of this talk where you can, we will share with Marilyn and Scott to share out with everybody as well. But the Pacific Language Weeks is a great place on our website for you to also come in and read and get some more information and stories directly from our knowledge holders in our Pacific communities. Reciprocity is acknowledging the rights of our people and the responsibilities of the museum in the space of sharing of knowledge. So one of the things in my time in Auckland Council, when I was working with a lot of our community, is that they were very wary and tired of lots of institutes and organisations coming to them to mine their information, mine their knowledge. What do they get in return? So that's reciprocity. What are we doing together to nurture the relationship together and see this relationship as long-term and spanning many, many years, not just this is what I want from you now, can you give it to us? So that reciprocity, that meaningful engagement, and that respect and integrity is a real key part of Teu Le Vā. We also have balance, symmetry, enacting obligations, respect, we're talking about respect, and valuing the diversity. So a lot of people go, there's the Pacific people here. Earlier on when I was growing up here in the 80s and 90s, it used to be called Polynesians over here. Now it's the Pacific people. And that box doesn't actually acknowledge and recognize all the uniqueness and the diversity of the languages, the cultures, and the people. We have a lot of similarities, but we also have a lot of differences as well. And those differences are very important. especially if you're engaging with our Pacific people and understanding what their different aspirations are with the museum, as well as what the different stories and tonga we have of theirs in our museum, and understanding those diversity of protocols, the cultural protocols, and the cultural way of doing things. I love this picture, just before I move on. And I've just realized in the picture before and in the picture of this, that in the background, we have the fantastic Dr. Malani Anai looking at our collections, and she's now become our new trust board member. So that's an added little insight into these photos. I didn't realize that until I just saw that. I was like, oh, hey, which was fantastic to see her engaged with our Pacific communities in our Pacific Collection Access projects. So the other thing I just want to touch on is we have the Pacific Advisory Group, and I want to acknowledge Marilyn here. She was one of the OGs of the first of this Pacific Advisory Group that came about in 2013, and they, they helped the museum, especially our CEO and our executive team, to give them advice around Pacific collection stories, programs, events, projects, and education, and also advice on going about future plans and how important our Pacific people are in those future plans, and how we can work best with our Pacific people in that space. I know I saw lots of questions coming up, but I think Marilyn and Scott will save that for after. And so without much ado, I'm going to now pass this on to Leone.
Alo, e sufua mau malelangi e mama. Scott and Marilyn, am I all good to go? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. Really appreciate everything that the Institute does, and particularly to Marilyn, thank you very much for being in the background of seemingly everything I hold dear in the Pacific cultural glam sector since before I was born, it sounds like. She's been in the background influencing things, and I really appreciate you, Marilyn. One thing I need to correct though, to Lolava in my bio is, sorry, that's a freight train, is I'm not an Ags old girl. I'm from the bustling metropolis of Avondale College, but that's okay. The school I'm most proud to be from actually is not, nothing wrong with Avondale. Avondale's great, but the schooling experience I really feel proud to belong to is Aotearoa and Samoa, which Marilyn talked about at the very beginning, the Samoan language preschool nest that Oli's mother Jan and father Papali'i Pita founded in the 80s. So I'm a proud alumnus of Aotearoa and Samoa there at Richmond Road Primary School. One thing that Oli's already touched on is just, as Pacific Island museum professionals that myself and Oli are, it's huge, that sense of accountability and the accountability that we feel personally to our communities that we represent. Oh my gosh, there's another freight train. Yeah, that sense of accountability weighs on us and is in the back of our minds whenever when we walk in the door at the museum, and then even after we leave, it's that how did we do in terms of representing our community interests at the museum. It's a 24/7 thing in the back of our minds, I would say. Yeah. So I don't consider myself an expert. My job title says associate curator, and that's great. But I just wanted to say that yes, this concept of Teu Le Vā it's a praxis that I work under. And for me, that's where my comfort space is, but also a space that I'm really excited to keep extending, because when you look at museums, even outside of Aotearoa, and going out wider and wider and wider, Auckland Museum is unique in that aspect of having a Pacific strategy, a Pacific agenda. And I think there's a lot of really innovative things that we've been able to do here at this institution in comparison to other places. Other places look at us now. And that's another sort of thing of accountability to keep also in the back of my mind. Lots of things to keep in the back of our minds, I think. So this section, I'm going to talk about a couple of things that in response to Richard's sort of question in the chat, ways of how we, the institution, have been engaging with Pacific communities over the past few years since Teu Le Vā, since our Teu Le Vā document was drafted in 2012. Sorry, another thing I need to say about that is in 2012, I was in the room while it was getting drafted. My name's in the back of the booklet. I chose the pictures in the document. But at that point in time, my role was really to be a listening person. I was a junior, listening to these two kind of really nut out all those things that are in that document. So I was listening back then. I'm now in a place where I have a little bit of power now. It's been quite, it's been heady and it's been wonderful also, but also again, that thing of accountability. How do I channel that power towards representing communities and engaging with communities a whole lot more? So Richard, in answer to your question, I have the following slides to show you about engagement. So yeah, the specific collection access project between those years 2016 and 2019, in the museum context, it was one of those projects as part of the Future Museum and Collections Readiness program of putting our collections more prominently in the public eye through digital channels. So a lot of capital investment went into hiring the staff to do cataloging, enriching records, photography, rehousing, and I think we're still, the bulk of those kinds of projects across our Māori taonga, social history, natural sciences, and Pacific. Something about this institution, just we seem to like to do all of the big ticket things all at the same time. And this was part of that sort of that program of digitizing collections and making them more accessible online. Could I please have the next slide? The thing with PCAP though is, we've got this Teu Le Vā document that was formally established in 2012, and it says this is how we are going to commit as a museum to including more community engagement. The thing about PCAP that sets it apart from these other collections readiness projects is that priority placed on community engagement. So on paper, oh, something's gone on with my box, but that's okay. On paper, the task was within 3 and a bit years, we're going to do all that collections work to make these more accessible online, the tasks that I talked about. However, what we're also going to do at the same time is create opportunities to engage with communities in Auckland. That's the thing about Auckland City, is that a lot of these Pacific communities, Polynesian communities that reside in Auckland still have those very strong ties back to the islands. Here's the sort of geographic expanse of those islands, and the numbers that you see that are a bit skewed at the moment. The numbers that you see next to the island group represent the number of objects in our collections from that island group. So we started with the Cook Islands, 946 objects. Could you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so this is one of the opening events. This is the opening event for this entire PCAP project that launched both the Cook Islands portion of this project, as well as just made an announcement, to the rest of the world. PCAP is open, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to commit to. Sorry, could you go back to the next slide? But within this picture, I like to show this picture because it shows already the tensions and the rewards of doing this. The reward being that our Cook Islands community here in Auckland had never had this opportunity on this large scale to visit and connect with the taonga that were from the island groups. But from a sort of a collection management or a collections care point of view, what we've got here is we've got our beautiful mamas, and some of them are wearing floral head garlands. Some of them are real flowers, and usually in a museum, we don't like having live, plant material and all that kind of thing in next to our collections. The other thing that you may see in this picture is just the amount of people in one room. The tension between, health and safety. You're supposed to only have this many people in a room like this close to taonga, versus just, again, that open accessness that PCAP really was. I see, people touching with no gloves, people, visitors outnumbering, 10 to 1 of museum staff. But it was in this tension and in this sort of middle space. For me, this is what Teu Le Vā is. It's nurturing these community relationships for the first time ever that this institution has done this, as well as balancing just care again for these objects. One last thing before I move from the slide is that there are no labels put out because I don't know the exact reason why, but even if we had printed out labels, there would really not be very much on that label to share with people because, could you go to the next slide? Not so much information because our information is skeletal, and I'll show you another picture after this one, but this, as well as the many weekend opportunities that PCAP provided for communities to come in and connect with taonga, making them events. So I'm hoping that you're aware of recent Pasefika vaccination events where they make it a party, where they make it a welcoming experience to have something potentially traumatic as a vaccination may be to some people, turning it into a welcoming event with manaakitanga at the very forefront, with community leaders obtaining resource, knowing that this is how they know their communities will react to something like this. In, I guess, the PCAP parallel was we had a specific position created in that project, the community navigator, who went out and fostered these relationships with communities as the program progressed through the different island nations, keeping in touch with people who, making connections with community leaders in each island community, asking them asking them to partner with us to make these experiences on weekends. What was the best way to do that? How could we welcome people into the museum building on the hill in the city in an appropriate and warm-filled way? How could we prepare ourselves as museum staff to learn words of respect, to just learn a bit more about each island group as we went? Because I'm a Samoan, I don't know everybody else in the Pacific really. I'm Samoan, Ileoti. I don't know very much more about my Tuvaluan or my Fijian cousins. So making these experiences so that museum staff could learn more on the job, as well as be respectful and hold space for these communities coming in. So this picture here is our PCAP Teu Le Vā approach to this museum task of enriching our catalogue records, right? These were, so during PCAP, we had a program of community knowledge holder sessions, identifying, our navigator, originated by Barbara Awhitu Makuati, who's now with Langimama Consultancy. She would go out and make contact with community leaders and ask them, who are the knowledge holders that could potentially help us enrich these records, help us with Indigenous terms for the objects that we have, which may really only be on our record as bowl or cup or mat. Help us, the museum, to enrich our information from that community-held Indigenous knowledge perspective point of view, because they hadn't been represented until that point in our records. And here is one example of a ethnology card, an old school ethnology card. It's got our number, it's got our date of when it was accessioned, it's got bowls from large gourds from Hawaii, and sort of the immediate provenance. So a lot of our taonga, a lot of our Pacific taonga usually may not say what village or who the maker was, might say what island group, maybe with a question mark. But more often than not, the provenance really identifies who gave it to the museum as opposed to who the maker was. So that was a ethnology register card. That was the kind of information that was then transferred onto our digital collection management system, CMS. And could you go back to that slide? That's the sort of information that gets put into our collection management system, and from there it goes on to collections online, and it's 4 or 5 pieces of information. So through PCAP, could you go to the next slide, please? Through PCAP, talking with knowledge holders and really getting a rich body of information, of knowledge, to then transfer in some parts to our online records. So what was a bowl becomes this ipu ava. So not every record obviously looks like this for PCAP, but this is a really wonderful example to me anyway of what happens when you speak to knowledge holders from a community. But it also threw up lots of different challenges for me as a cataloger, for my team as catalogers, because you don't just ask someone, what is this? You don't just cold call or sort of go into it asking and extracting information. The approach we took was talanoa, which is to talk over, to hear story, to talk story, and to treat the conversation that we had as sacred and important. And a lot of the pieces of information that we've got here, there are instances where knowledge holders asked us to stop recording, for instance. There are instances where knowledge holders said, this is not for your museum. I just want to give you some more context so I can give you the little bits that you're allowed to have. An experience like this for me so PCAP, I was a cataloger in charge of trying to take all this rich information that we're receiving in this story form and having to extract, having to take out the little bits of information that corresponds to a field in our Vernon management system. Something like that on a daily basis for 3.5 years. Very effective to me as a museum practitioner, because it threw up several issues for me as just in the way that there's a Western knowledge system and there is an Indigenous knowledge system here as well, and they're all different from each other. Sorry, can you go back to the next one? I'll tell you when the next one's on. Thank you. And now I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. What else did I have to say? Yeah, so PCAP, 3.5 years, 6,000 objects catalogued over this time. So the task on paper was completed. And that finished in 2019. Could you go to the next slide now, please? Yeah. For me, my contract at that time with PCAP finished, and I also decided, because of my experiences with PCAP, that I wanted to do postgraduate study. So Milani Anai, who you saw in one of the pictures earlier, she was my supervisor for my dissertation around Teu Le Vā as museum praxis, where I was able to sort of reflect on this PCAP experience for me as a cataloger, and then sort of work through some of these things that I've been thinking or struggling with in terms of what could Pacific museology look like. This picture here, so while I was off doing postgrad work with Milani and I, this is a picture here, Paula Legel. She is our associate curator for heritage publications. She, on these community events during weekends and days, she would bring documentary heritage from the library, museum library, down to showcase during these open days when we would bring out all these other taonga on an island communities belonging to an island community, and she would bring the documentary heritage equivalent down as well. She did this so many times, and she was able to really see how every time we had an event, Paula's table would be full of people just looking through the photographs or reading through some of the out-of-print books or looking through some of the archival material. Paula also Paula is responsible for my job, is where I'm trying to take this, is because with Paula perceives that in documentary heritage, we have all this other taonga upstairs. They were not part of PCAP. PCAP was about the objects. For Paula, it was about extending PCAP into the documentary heritage collections, because there is so much in the library and archives that that Pacific communities still don't know very much about. So she took it upon herself to advocate for my job, essentially to be created. She took the business case. She worked with Olivia, and in January of last year, I began this role as associate curator for documentary heritage Pacific. Next slide, please, Ollie. Here is a picture from the anecdote that Ollie talked about earlier, the handwritten letter that Paula found in the back of an out of print story, Legends and Stories of Rotuma book. In terms of engagement with documentary heritage, and starting in January last year, everything went online because of global pandemic. But being able to hold Zoom calls online like this at the beginning of the cycle of Pacific Language Weeks last year, Rotuma, in the calendar of Pacific Language Weeks, Rotuma is first, and it was their first ever language week, official language week, supported by the Ministry for Pacific Peoples. Conversations like this were still able to be had. Next one, please. So engagement has still been a possibility through these language weeks and these content pieces that we put out, again, overseen by Olivia. Another aspect of my role has been to look through our collections and see what's there and surface more. So for Samoan Language Week this year, I wrote a blog, an article about this unpublished work that we've got in the collection of the Samoan whaalupenga. So for Samoans, whaalupenga are, that saying about the only certainties in life being taxes and death and taxes. If it was a Samoan equivalent, for Samoans, the certainties are whaalawe-laves and whaalupengas, which is, family relational events that there are obligations around, and the importance of knowing village salutations. It's very hard to explain what this is in English, but this is a book, a collection of village salutations from around the Samoan Islands, particularly significant because this covers all of the Samoan Islands from the east and the west, so what is now American Samoa. This is according to our deputy chair for the Pacific Advisory Group, who's got a doctorate in Pacific history, he believes that this unpublished collection of these Whaalupinga is the earliest written in English Whaalupinga collection, if this makes sense. And this has been sitting here since 1922. Samoans and land court cases are still going on today, and they grab evidence, or the evidence is drawn from the likes of Augustin Kramer's works, who was a contemporary of the man who was in Samoa at the time, who collected all these Whaalupinga. And we finally digitized it and put it up online. So Samoan Language Week was a perfect time to show it off to people, let people know about it. It's been downloaded as a digital file 350 odd times. And that was when I checked the week after Samoan Language Week to say, talked to James, who's in charge of our collections online, and I asked James, how many times has this been downloaded? 8 days after the start of Samoan Language Week. Yeah, 350 plus times. So the demand is there. And I think I want to wrap it up here because I'm mindful of time. My job, although I'm still shy about the word curator, the root word is care. I've broken it down in my mind of CARE. In my mind, my job, this is a great one to leave on. My job is about collections or collections development. It's also about accessibility to what we have at the moment, because there's so much more than just, if we've got this incredible Whaalupinga, there's more. The R is for research, because I can't just say things without backing it up with research. And that E, again, for Richard, engagement through everything. So this is the slide I wanted to finish up on. It's an acquisition that we made last year at the end of the year. You've got Dr. Jess Pasisi on the left-hand side, who wrote a poem, and Cora Allen Wycliffe, who's a Niuean hiapo maker. She's essentially revitalizing that art form of Niuean art cloth making. They collaborated to create this hiapo work. It's a poem that takes the position of a piece of hiapo as it's being made in Niue, taken across the sea, ends up in a museum collection, and is lonesome because it's in the longing section of the Love and Loss exhibition at the moment. When we all go back to the museum one day, you'll be able to see it in that exhibition now. But it's a piece of hiapo longing for its home, or longing for people from its home. So at the end of the poem, it's taken out of a box, it's caressed by Niuean hands, and it just feels, it's a really lovely poem. I'm not doing it justice. And there's a voice, you can hear it online on our website. But for me, an acquisition like this, the power to buy things is a key. This has been a wonderful experience as a first-time collections curator. But to know that this is a hiapo, we've got quite a few other hiapo pieces in the collection from that early period, 1800s, early 1900s. The maker is unidentified, and we don't know exactly how it got from Niue to our, to the person who gave it to the museum. I like this picture because I know the artists personally. I know where and how they've come to be there. I was the delight, or just the significance of being able to influence a little bit so that they're in an exhibition at the museum. The money that went in to purchase this work, they used it to establish a fund for Niuean artists, for Niuean scholars to research museum collections. So the cyclical nature of something like this, because I'm in this job, because I had these PCAP experiences, because Teu Le Vā, 2012, because someone had, it's all starts somewhere, and I just want to leave it there 7:46, and just say, yeah, thank you for all this opportunity for me to speak, and to just get excited about Teu Le Vā and share with you a bit more. So, whakatai te le lava.
The whawhatai te le lava comes from me to both Olivia and Leone, and I have let them talk for an hour. Partly it's selfish because I was really interested in what they had to say, and I know how passionate they are about the work that they do at Auckland Museum. So we are very, very appreciative of your sharing your passion and knowledge with us. We've got about 10 minutes left, and you have answered some of Richard's question, Leone, but if there is anything else that you could add to Richard's question, which is how do the different Pacific communities in Tāmaki Makaurau engage with their collections from their cultures, and are there different levels of engagement between the different Pacific communities? And I think that you've given a fairly rich answer to that, both of you in different ways. But if there's anything that from this point that you'd like to add, Olivia.
Hello, lava whakatai, Marilyn, and thank you for the question, Richard. We have many different ways that our community now engage with us because PCAP opened the door, and really the manaakitanga, the care, the Teu Le Vā that was opened up to our Pacific communities, the trust has now started to really form. And with that trust has come engagement that is giving us a lot more enriching experiences than we could have ever asked for. One of them is that we now have documentary heritage doing a Pacific program, which is what Leone's role is in there. We don't currently have one in natural science. We would love that to happen because we have many of our communities really engaged and curious about our natural science collections, which number in the hundreds and thousands. And we have been using our Pacific Language Weeks to actually work with our communities to share their stories on natural science, on documentary heritage, and on human history. And so when I talked about our largest collection, it is not just human history. So our PCAP project was primarily for human history, and it only covered just over 6,000 of the human history collection, and there's 24,000 more. And so, we are world leading in this space. No other museum in the world is doing Indigenous engagement, connection, relationship, support, and knowledge sharing about their collections as Auckland Museum is. And that's incredible, but it also is a big responsibility. And with that responsibility, there is also the sharing of aspirations. So the museum wants to continue growing and enriching our collection with our communities about the taonga that we have, but also our Pacific communities. For Kiribati, you talked about Kiribati, Richard. One of the things the Kiribati community said to us is at first they didn't want our museum to have their collection, but after PCAP and after sharing experiences with us and seeing how much care and nurture and manaakitanga we gave their collection, gave out their people, and giving them opportunity to be online on our website speaking and sharing their stories and language and culture, they are now seeing the museum as the place for the future of their next generations. Their island is sinking. They know that their island one day will not be there. And so all the cultural artifacts and taonga and collections and stories, where do they go? And so the museum has a real key part to play with Tuvalu, Tokelau, Kiribati, and Rotuma, all these very small islands that, they understand their future. Our people think in 50s, hundreds of years, and so does the museum. So it's a natural fit in that way. But also it's about how can we work meaningfully with our Pacific communities to help them, and how do we help ourselves? And we have to stop being working in small projects. So PCAP was a small project. It was 3 years for a particular thing. We understand the success, we understand the learnings, and we understand now we have opened the door hugely to our Pacific communities, and they want more access to our collections, and they want to have, they see our museum as being a really significant part for the future of their next generations. So what does that mean for the museum, and how do we take that on? And I saw Marilyn's question, and the answer is we have to make this a BAU and part of our everyday program in the museum, and stop doing small projects. And for that to happen, we really need people to understand the significance of what we do and what we hold, and how we work with our Pacific people in that space. And that for it to become BAU, we need government investment, we need investment from other people to really understand that we are more than just a local small museum. We are actually now becoming the Pacific Centre Museum of the country. And the vision, and PAG have talked about this, the vision of being the Pacific Centre Research Institute is a big vision, but I don't think it is a big vision because our collections are the biggest in the Southern Hemisphere. It's our job now to be really responsible and commit to what PCAP started. PCAP was the start. It should not be the end, because of the enriching knowledge. You've seen the enriching knowledge that has come out. We've seen on our Pacific Language Weeks on our websites the incredible stories our Pacific people are sharing about our collections. And Leone can testify this for the documentary heritage. They're enriching their collection now with working with our community. Documentary heritage is now a program. That's a great step. We now need those programs across human history, across natural science, and it should just be a major priority and an understanding for people to understand what our cultural uniqueness is, and how significant this will be for many Pacific islands in the future. Kiribati have said to us, we want to work more closely with you, because this is where we were going to be bringing our children in the future to connect to their culture and language of their history and past.
Whawhitai. With the short time that we have left, could you comment on the Pacific Rainbow LGBTIQ plus collection items? This is probably for you, Leone, since you were right there and head of, documenting.
Oh, don't give me a promotion that I don't deserve.
No, you were there busy typing things, and I saw you.
Thank you for that comment, Scott. So I've been in my job since January, at least. So been in my job since January. In terms of acquisitions, it's been the biggest learning curve in this job so far has been that acquisitions process, because obviously it goes through lots of different steps. I have to coordinate with people. I've made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think I've made just under 10 acquisitions since January last year. And of of that 10, so I can name who I've got. From Vunilangi Vo, I've had the pleasure of collecting works from non-binary cartographer David Garcia. That's been one particular one. I'm in the process of collecting works from Yuki Kihara. Yuki Kihara being a senior Pasefika Whawhawhine artist who's going to be representing at the Venice Biennale in 2022. We are well overdue to have works from our senior Pacific artists. There's more. Tanungango's, one of his posters, some of his works through Vunilangi Vo. I've been able to make an acquisition.
Vunilangi Vo is a gallery that was established by Fijian Emma Tavola, based out in Otahuhu. And she has special connections to South Auckland artists and also with FAF Swag.
So there's collections from the rainbow community is important in my mind, in my sort of frame of mind. But I also know that I can't just go along and, hey, I'll buy from you. The way I want to work is to make connections and talk with and get recommendations from, or talk with artists and say, what would you want us to represent or have in the collection from your experience? Yeah, I think a big gap in our current collection in documentary heritage in terms of media types is oral histories. And I feel like that's a very rich aspect to be getting into, particularly with Pacific communities, because when it comes to keeping papers or archives, there's a lot of people that just don't have that, individuals anyway. They don't have big paper archives of things. And I think through my experiences with PCAP and those Talanoa sessions, that's going to be a channel through which I approach and make these relationships and connections with and collect in that area, in that form.
I just also wanted to add, we do, as you know, we have a rainbow policy and the rainbow tick with the museum, and it is one of our priorities of across the museum and our departments as well.
If you've liked this video, please make sure you like and subscribe so you can check out more of our cafes in the future.